The Victorian era that preceded the Edwardian era really ended in 1901 when Queen Victoria died, and she had been in mourning for many decades, so black had been quite a common colour.
Correct me if I'm wrong, the Queen started the trend of wearing white in terms of weddings.
Queen Victoria didn't start the trend, but she was the person everyone looked to.
Right.
So it was very,
she popularized
had a big effect.
it,
yes.
Right. And there's an interesting quote that I read that says, "Men act, women appear." This was a very exemplified time for that. Pretty much up to this point, they stayed at home, they were property. Where men were going out, their dress was more conservative. They weren't there to show themselves off. The way that the women could show their status was through their dress.
Instead of their latest sports car, they had their woman bedecked from head to toe.
Yes. To the T. That was his way of saying, this is how much status I have.
And also, this is a time of servants. Mm-hmm. So although women were only seen, they didn't have to do the laundry themselves. They didn't have to burp their child over their shoulder. There were other people to do all these things, so they could look very pristine and clean.
You know, even if people weren't wearing completely white, they would always have, you know, the shirtwaist and the skirt to go with it. Everybody had white shirtwaist.
The shirtwaist factory fire was seminal in the introduction of union workers' rights.
When the fire happened, I think it was in 1911, and all of those women died in the fire. It was the worst tragedy. The working conditions were horrible. If you look at a workroom when you're working in it, you get scraps of fabric on the floor, you get patterns everywhere, you know, these tissue patterns, and at the end of the day, you have to clean it before you start up again the next day. Every workroom does that, but they didn't do that. And people were smoking, you know, the men were smoking in the thing, and apparently something ignited all of the fabric or the tissue, and the tissue was hanging above their heads. All the patterns just hung above their heads. And the fire broke out. They were on the 7th, 8th, and 9th floor of this building, and the women on the 7th and 8th floor got out, but the women on the 9th floor didn't, and they just burned to death.
The fashion industry has been the main reason for union organization in the mass production of goods.
And it was also one of the few jobs women could get.
Yes.
Then was working in these horrible factories.
Doing piecework, where women are making many, many versions of the same small portion of a finished good, was the way poor women and immigrants made a living. Well, I think you can't talk about the early 20th century without talking about the struggle for women to get the vote, which they actually got sooner in the United States than they did in England. The images of the suffragettes that we saw were frequently wearing white dresses. I wonder if they did this for effect, if it was just that was what was worn at the time, or did they know that it carried with it the connotations of virginity that we have today.
I don't know if it was so much virginity as it just became, you know, more like a uniform.
Well, I also think of the onset of World War I, and the first acceptable job for a woman was to be a nurse, and nurses wore white. Women were wearing the Edwardian dress, but with an apron and the long skirts in white as nurses, and little white headdresses, little white starched caps. Now, as time went by, they needed women to do much more than nurse, and they had to go into the munitions factories. That, of course, had its own effect on fashions of the time.
I also think it was the flu epidemic that killed off so many people. They said that all the world wars we've had combined don't equal the number of people that were killed in the 1918 flu.
It was 50 million, I think,
and I think
flu.
Anytime you have a great disaster or an economic time like we're having now, people are more open for change when that happens.
During the Victorian era, women were very sexually restrained. There was very little information, publicly speaking, hardly privately, regarding sexual identity. So sex was absolutely something for a husband and a wife. And again, since women were property, it was pretty much up to the man when and how that was going to happen. Since a woman was a possession, was something to be prized, you wanted one that was untouched, you wanted one that was pure. I think it dates back to the church, really, this idea of white being a representation of what is pure or good. In general, they didn't have anyone to turn to talk about sex. They didn't have, I mean, there were a few books out at the time that were very vague, but it wasn't really until the Kinsey Report that women were able to openly talk about their sexuality. I mean, this time there was no generalized public education system for that anyway. So there was no way for them to really know, and it was certainly improper to ask. It was mostly about preparing your daughter to be a good wife, and you gave the most minimal advice possible, which was do whatever your husband tells you. However, I think at this point, you give someone a little freedom, they're going to run with it. There was a lot of questioning in terms of, well, am I truly property? Do I have rights as a woman? We've fought as right to vote in terms of our entire society. What about at home? Do I have the right to be an individual at home? And so you had more books coming out at this time, written by women for women, about their roles as a wife in a marriage that did not necessarily define them as property. One woman, Dr. Marie Stopes, published a self-help benevolent scientific book in 1918, and the book was entitled Married Love. And she stated, "Today, particularly in the middle classes in this country, marriage is far less really happy than its surface appears." I think it was important that Margaret Sanger was making them aware that they didn't have to be pregnant their entire life. It was helpful for them in terms of health. A lot of women would die from childbirth. Now you could limit how many children you had. Your entire existence was not based on your reproductive capability, which was kind of ingrained in your head from childhood.
Let's not forget that at the end of the 19th century, women were actually being educated in real terms, not just learning how to cook and sew, but to actually read and write and study. And as we know today, any time in a developing country where you increase the education of women, you have a lowered birth rate. And this is something that Margaret Sanger was completely aware of. And she knew that in order to encourage women to understand that they had a choice as far as the number of children they could bear, they needed to be informed and educated. And I'd also like to add that most of the people, there's tremendous exodus from the country, from the agricultural existence into the cities, where in the farms, it behooved a family to have as many children as possible to work the lands. And we are now looking at a slightly different state of affairs in the cities. I think 1920 was a watershed year because women got the right to vote.